Hi everyone, welcome to this first of two webinars on monitoring, control and surveillance on the high seas. Well, I'd say good to see you. I only see the fellow speakers here, but hopefully you're all well and coping with the strange circumstances wherever you are and whichever time zone you're in. I'll start myself with just a quick introduction to the Strong High Seas project and what we're going to be talking about, as well as introducing our three speakers. So we have with us today Tony Long, who is currently the CEO of Global Fishing Watch, which he'll tell you all about shortly. Before that, Tony had a long career of 27 years in the Navy, the British Navy, so has a lot of on-the-water experience, really practical experience with vessel monitoring and tracking and all the issues on the water. And before Global Fishing Watch, also worked with Pew on their Eyes on the Seas project and also on their IUU fishing campaign. Claudia Kremers is my colleague at IDDRI, has been with us just over a year now, I believe, came to us from working on EU fisheries at Client Earth, which is a law firm working on environmental cases in Brussels, and has been working on this project and particularly looking at monitoring, control and surveillance on the high seas. And so she'll present some of our thoughts from her research on the ongoing negotiations for a new high seas treaty. And then we have Sophie Mergot, who is the Belgian Special Envoy for the Ocean. And I've now known Sophie for a number of years as she's been working on the high seas negotiations. One of the true optimists and sort of constant forces in the EU negotiation team. So it's great to have you with us as well to give us a sense of where the negotiations are at and where MCS fits in. So quite briefly, the Strong High Seas project is a collaboration between a number of partners. You see all the logos at the bottom of the screen there, funded by the German government as part of their International Climate Initiative. And there's a range of different work packages, one of which is MCS. It focuses on two regions, the Southeast Pacific and the Southeast Atlantic. So we work with partners on the ground there to develop sort of new thinking and cooperation about high seas issues in those regions. So as we know, the high seas covers this sort of huge patch of the ocean. There's a lot of governance frameworks already in place, but they are quite fragmented, usually on a sector by sector basis. And so the UN has started negotiations, or member states have started negotiations for a new treaty for the high seas that would try to create less fragmentation and a sort of new momentum for cooperation on the high seas. This would be the third implementing agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention after the Seabed Mining Agreement and the Fish Stocks Agreement from '94 and '95. And it contains what is often referred to as the package deal of elements. So this is marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, which includes things like marine protected areas and other management measures, environmental impact assessments, so trying to better assess the activities and the impacts of those activities on the high seas, and also to strengthen capacity building and technology transfer. As you probably all know, for a number of these areas, there already exist certain obligations, but the aim is to sort of strengthen these obligations and cooperation, particularly around these package deal issues. We'll hear a little bit more about where the negotiations are, but the sort of informal discussions that led to the negotiations have gone on for quite a long time, as many of us know, and I see Sophie nodding enthusiastically. We are currently waiting for the final session of the Intergovernmental Conference, which would have been in March this year, but is currently delayed. And Sophie will tell us a bit about the discussions that are still ongoing informally between countries to keep the momentum going and develop these proposals. And then just quickly, before I let Tony take the floor to say a little bit about the MCS work that we've been doing as part of the Strong High Seas project. We've held 2 workshops in Paris, looking at technologies and looking at policies for MCS respectively. And then almost exactly a year ago, we did a workshop with partners in the Southeast Pacific with the Permanent Commission for the South Pacific based in Guayaquil in Ecuador. And so that's the photo in the bottom left there. And we have a final workshop planned in the Southeast Atlantic region, which has also been delayed, but will hopefully take place next year. And you'll see there in the top right the reports that we've developed from these workshops. So firstly, a report looking at options for a high seas agreement and other ways to strengthen cooperation on MCS. And Claudia will talk a bit more about that. And then in the top right, the paper recently released just a few days ago, in fact, on the region of the Southeast Pacific. And there'll be a final report for the Southeast Atlantic as well next year. So that looks more at what the status is in the region, goes into detail on what countries within those organizations can do to strengthen their cooperation. So I believe that's it for me for the moment. And with that, I will hopefully give Tony control of my computer. I would say the other speakers are welcome to turn video off for the moment if they wish, or if Tony would like an audience, we can stay here smiling back at you. But otherwise, I'll leave it to you, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn, for that introduction. I was going to say interruption there. Introduction. Hopefully the slides will work from there. So I've been asked to speak a little bit about Global Fishing Watch's work, our country partnerships, give an oversight into the monitoring, control and surveillance technologies, and then mention around capacity building, around technology transfer, data collection, and sharing and cooperation. I'm hoping that I'm effectively addressing all of those 4 bullets at the same time as I reach through this presentation. And I'm also hoping that some of the information I give is becoming increasingly familiar to the people that tend to join these sorts of conferences, because the message is consistent, whether it's from Global Fishing Watch or Ocean Mind or Vulcan Skylight. The right technologies used in the right way can really help change the way the ocean is governed, and we should see some change. So here's a little bit on Global Fishing Watch. Is it changing, Glenn? Right, okay, it seems to be quite a long delay, so I might ask you to take that back if that delay continues, because I can see it will give me some problems. So Global Fishing Watch is a not-for-profit organization. We created to publicly share fishing information and knowledge about human activity at sea to enable fair and sustainable use of our ocean. I say human activity because traditionally we've been very focused on fishing vessel activity, but it's increasingly clear that other human activity is having an impact. And I think there are data sources that, if overlaid with fishing vessel activity, can start to give a bigger picture. So perhaps noise pollution in the water, seabed mining, or also human activities that impact on the success and failure of fisheries. We want to help drive policies that will protect biodiversity and fisheries and livelihoods. And we feel that the only way that this can be done is with international cooperation. And it's with thanks to our funding partners that our users are able to access the Global Fishing Watch platform for free. So it's, yeah. Did I click that, Glenn, or did you click that?
No, that was me, actually. It says that it's waiting for you to take the control, but I can click through, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm going to let you click through because I think there's quite a long delay between the mouse click and what happens. So
yeah, no problem.
This is a theory. You know, if we can get countries to share their fishing vessel data around the world, we're going to have a more complete and connected picture of global fishing activity. And we can then hope that people will fish more responsible for many years to come. What is very clear to us is that if people create their own data holes and there's effectively electronic walls between where data exists and who has that data and access to that data, we're only really providing a maze for the people who want to take their activity and hide it. We're giving them walls to hide behind, and we need to break those walls down. Next slide. There's a few key moments, I think, that are starting to show why technology and data can help. In particular, with Global Fishing Watch's case, traditionally, a lot of fishing vessel data has been proprietary. But since Indonesia shared their data back in 2016, we've seen Panama, Peru, Chile, and Costa Rica all commit and share their information to Global Fishing Watch. We also have Ecuador and Namibia close to sharing their information in the final throes of the agreements. And the team at Global Fishing Watch are working on around 5 more countries at the moment that are interested in sharing their data. And we've got an ambition that we'll reach 20 countries by 2022, but I'd really like to see many more countries soon after that. So the argument about proprietary data being sensitive is slowly and surely waning, although there are still reasons for proprietary data to have a cause, and there are ways around that. So we share the information in Fishing Watch 3 days late. It's also redacted slightly and aggregated. The data is always owned by the countries. They are in control of that data. But we are seeing that proprietary data break down, and this is particularly important for high seas. Next slide. We've also seen that by having the open data, people have been able to provide really significant research. So we've got over 20 university research partners at Global Fishing Watch now, and there's been some significant papers published. One in particular from a couple of years ago with the economics of the high seas fleet, showing that the subsidies on bonded labor are probably providing the fact that it's only economical, 50% of the fleet would be uneconomical without the support of subsidies and bonded labor, and there's more. We've also seen the FAO publish the first ever global atlas of AIS fishing data to give a clearer picture of where the fleets are operating around the world. And then recently, in partnership with Pew, we've published the carrier vessel portal, which is providing information on transshipment activity around the world, particularly focused on the tuna fisheries. And then most recently, we worked with several agencies in order to publish a paper on what was happening in North Korean waters against the sanctions there, to show that more than 900 vessels that originate from China are fishing illegally in those waters, displacing North Korean boats out onto the high seas, which many are then wrecked and get washed up in Japan. These papers are being published. And then this year, we are moving towards a marine reserves management tool that will allow layers of data to be accessed in one place to see how, what shape, where best we could put marine protected areas around the planet, and whether the ones that we already have in place are working. And this tool can be put and aligned with other agencies like OceanMind, who are doing more enforcement focused work, in order to provide a nice layer of data both for management and enforcement. Next slide. And we're seeing, many people were skeptical of public data being useful, but it is proving very useful. We've supported Indonesia since 2017. Monthly reports going in to help them with their own domestic waters, but several high-profile cases that have involved agencies with Interpol and other agencies like OceanMind, but complex areas where more than one state have been involved in the monitoring of one vessel fishing on the high seas. If you go to our website, there's an interesting story of the motor vessel Nika, which was followed from the Southern Ocean back to Indonesia. Similarly, OceanMind have done work against vessels that were related to the Nika, the STS-50, which just shows how complex it can be to make sure you can monitor a vessel and bring all the right agencies together in order that an enforcement occurs. We're increasingly working with our open data to provide support to coastal states. And you can see in partnership with other agencies as well, UNODC, Trigmat Tracking and Vulcan Skylight, as well as with agencies such as the US Coast Guard, specifically in the Pacific, to help with their patrol planning and the targeting of the appropriate areas in order to get the best return on their boardings and investigations. Next slide. So the technology, I think we're all becoming mini experts on the technology. I think most people now know what AIS is, Automatic Information System, that system fitted to the vessels to help avoid collision that many people are now using in order to monitor the fisheries as well. And the vessel monitoring systems are the traditional transponders fitted to vessels that flag states, coastal states, and the owners should be using to monitor their fleet. But we know that the VMS is not fitted to all vessels and not all countries operate it, and that actually the VMS systems don't always talk to each other. So even with the traditional transponders that we can use, there's gaps. So what we're seeing is the technology platforms are starting to draw on other data. Radar from space is particularly useful. It works at night, it works through cloud, it can detect fairly large objects floating on the water, and therefore we know whether something is in an area, very useful for marine protected areas and remote areas. But also optical imagery, effectively photographs from space or remote sensors, which at the right granularity can give you very clearly the type of vessel and whether it's operating gear or transshipping. And also the visual spectrum. So we're using detections of lights on the surface of the water to find out whether there's a vessel present or not. I'll give you some examples of that. Then the very sort of latest area that people have started to look at is radio frequency, which is effectively the detection of radio emissions from a vessel, whether it be from the AIS or other sensors on board their ship, that can give us an idea of their presence. And you'll see companies like Hawkeye 360 or Unseen Labs are busy promoting this work at the moment. And there's definitely utility for these types of data to be used for countering illegal fishing in the future. Next slide. So just to put that a little bit visually, to a couple of quick slides. This is a snapshot of an area just to well, you can see Australia, Indonesia, and the Western Pacific. But the blue is Automatic Information System. That's like a period of time. And as you can see, there seems to be a lot of gaps. So when Indonesia shared their data, next slide, suddenly a large area that seemed to be blank ocean was filled in again. There's several reasons for this. Not all vessels in this area fitted with AIS. But even if they are, there's a bit of a black hole in this region where the AIS data doesn't always get into the satellites or the ground stations. So you need the layers of data. And then one more slide, Glenn. The yellow that's just appeared is what we call VIRS, it's light detection. So where we're not seeing AIS and we haven't had VMS shared with us, there's still indication of a lot of activity on the surface of the water. And that VIRS, the infrared use there, has had all of the non-fishing vessel data taken out of it. So everything you're looking at on that slide now is fishing vessel data only. It doesn't include merchant vessels and otherwise. Next slide. And then very quickly to see how we can use synthetic aperture radar from space. This is a snapshot of the Adriatic. And what you can see there is everything that's been detected by radars from satellite. Next slide. What we can do is extract from that data things that we know are either static installations, sat within shipping lanes, or have transponders that indicate they're other than fishing. And we can remove that. Next slide. And then we can color in the ones that we know are fishing. So these will be vessels sharing maybe their AIS. In particular, as we know, the Europeans mandate the use of AIS on their fishing fleet. And we can now start to see what we know. So we can, as you can see from this slide now, we can see the shipping lane still. We can see the vessels that are telling us they're fishing vessels. And then we add bottom features, as in the oceanography, and look at the other data. And with the next slide, you'll see in white areas that we believe is fishing vessel activity that is not currently being tracked. So this particularly talks about Albania in the south there, just to the right of Italy's heel. there's a feature in the water there that the vessels tend to congregate around, and you can see there's a lot of vessels there with no AIS. We know there's no VMS there either, but we know that they're all fishing vessels. So a combination of the VMS, the AIS, the lights, the radar starts to build up that picture for people who are interested in what is happening out on the water. Next slide. So I'm going to be a bit provocative now. There's a lot we can do when it comes to enforcement and monitoring out on the waters. Global Fishing Watch's view is that fishing vessel data should be transparent. It should be transparent because when you apply it to something like the high seas, the global commons, then really we need a collaborative solution that is affordable and scalable. And what we know is that enforcement on the high seas is extremely difficult because it needs someone to lead. And then you're faced with picking up a vessel that's perhaps flagged to one country, captained by another person from another country, crewed by another country, owned by another country, and the ability to sort of drive down and understand exactly who's going to enforce against that vessel is a challenge. So we're hoping to see that there's a collaborative solution where we drive to reward compliance rather than drive nations to invest in purely enforcement. So that compliance will help target where enforcement needs to be by using techniques like I've just shown you, and also allow port inspectors to understand which vessels are coming to port with information missing, and therefore should be the priority for inspection. Now, the high seas are also a shared resource. So, when it comes to the governance of the high seas, there really should be shared information about who is extracting what from the high seas. And again, transparency would help drive that. So if you want to fish on the high seas, you should have to share the data and make it clear where and what you have fished. And ultimately, because it's such a big problem, enforcement through traditional means is just not affordable at the rate that we need to do it on the high seas, and it's equally not available. There's only a few nations in the world that can really apply themselves to this sort of patrol, and therefore it won't be ubiquitous and it won't be reliable. So we have to build a combination of the solution that will be transparency, that will drive compliance and act as a deterrent, and then really target the enforcement assets where they'll have most effect. And it'll be interesting to see where we go on the conversation later. So Glenn, with that, I'll hand back over to you and look forward to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tony. And always really enjoy seeing Global Fishing Watch presentations with these wonderful graphics and sort of really getting a sense of what, what this activity looks like in practice. Before I move on to Claudia, I wonder if I can, as you were being provocative, just press you quickly on this question of sort of transparency and how far that can take us. You mentioned briefly at the start that you've already had some progress with various countries and some sort of on the water success. And it seems that the technology is moving very quickly, and each year develops sort of exponentially. Do you think that this sort of transparency and technology is alone, enough to sort of drive compliance, or do we still need to invest in this sort of cooperation and treaties and that sort of thing as well? How far can we get with transparency?
So the transparency and technology. So the technology can only provide you with the information you need in order for something to happen. There still has to be a policy behind it. So no different to a speed camera on a motorway. You go past the speed camera, it flashes. The technology has now just captured your car, but there has to be a policy behind to what fine you're going to get and how you get it. So it's the same out on the high seas. We can provide this information. Someone has got to act on it, and hence we highlight the nation-state leadership. Someone has got to lead. In the sense of whether the technology is getting too far advanced for the treaties, I mean, that was probably happening years ago. From the moment UNCLOS was written, the sudden and fairly rapid expansion of the industrial fleet, they were using technologies way in advance of what was predicted at the time UNCLOS was written. And therefore it's seen that there's like this gap. But really, I think it needs a more modern interpretation there's a shared resource. The technology is there to show who's using the high seas, who's fishing where, and we should be able to go back to those countries to work with them in order to make sure that they're doing it in a way that at least fits the UNCLOS treaty, but certainly that countries can be ensured that the technology can provide them with the answers they need in order to make robust policies.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Tony. I think that's a great way to lead into Claudia's presentation, which looks a little bit at the negotiations and where we can start to try and press a bit on MCS in those negotiations and fill that gap a little bit. So Claudia, I shall give you the floor.
Thank you, Glenn. Just checking 1 second whether I can change the slide myself. No. Yes, now it works. Great. Thanks, Glenn. So Tony's presentation gives us a glimpse of the constantly developing MCS technologies that we can use to monitor human activities in the deep and distant waters of marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. I will now present some approaches we can take to strengthen MCS from a policy perspective, including through the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty that's currently being negotiated at the UN. So firstly, a note on the definition of MCS. I'm glad that Tony mentioned that Global Fishing Watch will work on other human activities besides fisheries, because indeed MCS can be used for many different purposes. It can be used for the fight against IUU fishing and other transnational illegal activities, such as money laundering and human and drug trafficking, the designation, monitoring, and enforcement of marine protected areas, better data for stock assessments, and mapping of the impact of human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. It can help keep track of threats like marine pollution, such as oil spills, plastics, and ghost nets. It can enhance maritime safety through monitoring traffic and supporting search and rescue operations. And it can help increase food safety and traceability. Tony just gave a really good overview of some of the latest technology that supplemented traditional tools such as logbooks and patrol vessels. So I will not go into detail, but here are some more examples of MCS tools. So while the MCS toolkit is growing rapidly, it's clear that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's exactly as what Toby mentioned. We have the MCS tools and the technology, but it depends on what kind of policy we're trying to implement. There are a range of factors that need to be considered when evaluating the suitability of a particular MCS action. For example, some MCS tools generate a wealth of data, but might require significant financial and human resources, as well as capacity for data storage and analysis. We've seen that MCS procedures are often not implemented in a uniform manner, which can undermine efforts to conserve and sustainably use marine biodiversity. We've identified 3 key challenges to MCS. And you probably, they're not come out of the blue, so you might already know them. So first of all, in high seas, flag states are exclusively responsible for the control of vessels flying their flag. And there are only limited legal provisions for enforcement measures against states that fail to meet their obligations. Commitment to the effective exercise of this flag state responsibility varies. Secondly, as you probably know, the high seas are characterized by a fragmented governance framework. Just like what Glenn mentioned, it's composed of various sector or region-specific organizations and conventions, often with overlapping mandates and members. Not all human activities in the high seas are adequately regulated, and not all regions are covered. This makes effective cooperation challenging. States and other actors may have conflicting priorities, resulting in enforcement measures that are insufficient to ensure compliance. Thirdly, the lack of uniform and equal implementation of MCS rules can partly be explained by differences in states' capacities and willingness to eliminate non-compliance. MCS enforcement can be costly to implement, especially on the high seas, which may present challenges for developing states in particular. But it is, of course, also the political willingness of states that decides whether MCS will be effective or whether MCS tools are used in general. So through our research, we have identified 4 approaches to strengthen MCS in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The first approach is the technology approach. This is a bit what Tony mentioned. So we have an increasing availability and declining cost of technologies, which is likely to significantly change the MCS landscape in the coming years, because it makes technologies and MCS tools more accessible to a range of actors and provides flag states with greater oversight. Such developments have mostly focused on fisheries, but as Global Fishing Watch has been looking at how to monitor oil spills, for example. So these technologies, these MCS tools, can not only be used for in the fisheries context, but in the future, this also has a huge potential to monitor other human activities. Another way to strengthen MCS in areas beyond national jurisdiction is to take a co-creation approach. In order to increase coherence and compliance, future roles and projects concerning the high seas should be co-created with stakeholders. By taking a collaborative approach, there's a higher chance that ocean users, such as fishers, will take ownership in the process of collecting data, will perceive the management system as legitimate, and will be more compliant. So I think a key example of this is CCTV cameras on board. There's a lot of criticism from this from the fishing industry. So if a state would really like to make this a compulsory requirement, this should be something, there should be a co-creation approach with this tool. So the third approach we can take is the policy approach. And this is where I'll go back to later as well for the High Seas Treaty. But there are also, besides the High Seas Treaty, there are also other policy options that states can use to strengthen MCS and ABNJ, such as encouraging flag states to require vessel monitoring systems and to proactively share this data with RFMOs, to ensure there's an appropriate and effective penalty system in place with sanctions that really deter illegal activities, and by improving accountability and transparency. This could, for example, be done through compulsory flag state performance assessments. Then the fourth approach to strengthen MCS in ABNJ is the market approach. This is especially relevant in the fisheries context, because with other human activities, there's of course no market or trade that can be influenced. Market measures that are currently being used enhance traceability and transparency, such as catch documentation schemes and eco-labeling. So now I'll zoom into one of the measures, so like the policy approach, which is through the High Seas Treaty. So MCS, for those of you who know the treaty, Glenn has already a bit explained the introduction that the treaty deals mostly with a package deal of issues that you can also see on the slide. And as you can see, MCS and fisheries as well is not explicitly included in the package deal of issues that are part of the negotiations. And we cannot realistically expect the upcoming negotiations to create a global MCS system. However, we have identified that there's a two-way relationship between MCS and the High Seas Agreement. On the one hand, MCS is crucial to implement and enforce the rules of the future treaty. And on the other hand, it could help reinforce and complement existing MCS obligations, thereby providing renewed impetus for strengthening compliance with international rules. So far in the negotiations, we've seen that negotiators prefer discussing the substantive issues first. But in the draft text, it is visible that MCS is a cross-cutting issue that can play a key role in all four elements of the package deal. In the context of marine genetic resources, the draft text includes provisions obliging states to monitor and report on when MGRs are accessed. This could provide insights into who is conducting what kind of MGR activities, where, and for what purpose. And it could increase transparency and facilitate the establishment and implementation of any future benefit sharing arrangements, which is one of the key controversies also in the current negotiations. Then on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, the draft text includes provisions on international cooperation and coordination, implementation, and monitoring and review. MCS could play a key role in the development of ABMT proposals, the implementation of any management measures, and monitoring their outcomes. As you all probably are aware, effective MCS is a crucial factor in the success of marine protected areas. In relation to environmental impact assessments, the draft text includes obligations for states to conduct public notification and consultation, to publish and communicate the results of the assessments, and to ensure that the environmental impacts of the authorized activities are reviewed. The draft text includes a non-exhaustive overview of types of capacity building and technology transfer activities in the annex. Some of them could be used as a basis to strengthen MCS capacity, such as technical support for data monitoring and reporting, increased cooperative links between regional institutions, and collaboration and cooperation in marine science. And then there's also something to be said about institutional arrangements and the clearinghouse mechanism. Because MCS is a cross-cutting issue, it also has to do with that. The draft treaty suggests that the so-called clearinghouse mechanism, and for those who are not aware of this terminology, it's basically an open access data platform for which the details still have to be decided. So this clearinghouse mechanism could enable states parties to access and publicize information on capacity building and technology transfer opportunities. In relation to MCS, this mechanism could, for example, encourage state parties to share best practices, increase capacity for the design and implementation of MCS technologies and policies, and highlight opportunities to collaboratively monitor activities at sea. So based on an analysis of the text, we've identified 3 main potential pathways to strengthen MCS through the High Seas Treaty. Firstly, the treaty can reinforce existing general obligations relevant to MCS, such as those regarding cooperation and coordination, transparency, and reporting. This is also related to what Tony has said in his previous conversation. Transparency could, for example, be explicitly included in Article 5 on general principles and approaches, which would help ensure that it's applied consistently throughout the agreement. Moreover, the treaty could urge flag, port, and coastal states to ensure compliance and call for sub-regional and regional cooperation in enforcement, as is also, I hope you don't hear the police in the background, but well, I'm in Paris in the office, it's still lively here. In any case, going back to where I was. So the treaty could urge flag, port, and coastal states to ensure compliance and call for sub-regional and regional cooperation in enforcement, as is also done in the United Nations Fish Stock Agreement. And then what we also notice is that in the chapter on area-based management tools and on marine protected areas, we saw that state parties are required to ensure compliance and enforcement by vessels flying their flags. But we would suggest to include this requirement like as part of the general, as part of the treaty as a whole, and not only related to the chapter on area-based management tools and marine protected areas. Because as I just mentioned, MCS also plays a role in the other elements of the package deal, and especially flag state enforcement. That's the key issue during the negotiations. Secondly, the treaty can define a strong MCS role for the clearinghouse mechanism by specifying that it shall serve as a platform to share best MCS practices, exchange data on MCS activities, and match capacity building needs in relation to MCS tools and methods for assessment. The treaty could specified types of MCS information states parties are obliged to share through the clearinghouse mechanism. For example, flag states can be obliged to report to the clearinghouse mechanism on accessed marine genetic resources after material has been deposited. The treaty could include specific references to building MCS capacity in order to reduce the burden of reporting requirements on developing states and assist them in meeting their obligations. So lastly, the draft treaty text suggests that state parties could be required to submit a monitoring, research, and review plan as part of the proposals for ABMTs and MPAs. So we suggest that the treaty could further require submission of the MCS strategy that considers the possible technological tools and institutional frameworks available to ensure compliance. Incorporating an MCS strategy for ABMT proposals could provide an initial indication of the resources required to ensure effective MCS of the proposed measure. And it could encourage state parties to consider the kinds of MCS tools they have at their disposal for different kinds of ABMTs. For example, this could include consideration of innovative technological tools, such as satellite monitoring for large MPAs, and consideration of potential partnerships and capacity building activities, such as partnerships with Global Fishing Watch, for example. This could be a way to reduce the likelihood of paper park management of MPAs on the high seas, because we constantly hear new targets for marine protected areas, and we think we all agree that it would be great to have marine protected areas in the high seas, but if you don't have sufficient MCS measures in place, then yeah, there's nothing really, we cannot really do, or like there's nothing to be happy about to have a certain target or a certain percentage. So in conclusion, MCS is an implementing tool for states to meet international obligations regarding human activities on the high seas. We've seen there's a great variety of MCS tools available, so technology is really not the issue here. But reliance on flag state responsibility, governance gaps in ABNJ, and the lack of capacity are the main challenges. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to MCS. It depends on which rules you're trying to monitor, what kind of obligations you're looking at. Cooperation and coordination is key. I really like this quote of the chair of the Fishery Africa Task Force, who said, "The cheapest tool in fighting IUU fishing is the sharing of information and intelligence through cooperation among all MCS practitioners." So there are 3 easy ways to strengthen MCS in the treaty: by reinforcing MCS obligations and principles, providing a strong MCS role in the clearinghouse mechanism, and by incorporating an MCS strategy in ABMT proposals. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Claudia. That's a really great overview of the negotiations and how MCS fits in. Before I ask Sophie to take the mic, I wonder if I could just ask you one quick sort of question for additional information, because we know that a lot of MCS developed in relation to fisheries, and you mentioned quite early in the presentation that there are lots of fisheries management organizations that already exist. There were some regions, I think, where there isn't an RFMO. But what is the role of those organizations already in MCS, and like, are they doing work already to strengthen, to strengthen MCS on the high seas before this treaty is even there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, regional fisheries management organizations play a very significant role in strengthening MCS. Because they can establish minimum standards on what the states that are members of these organizations have to comply with. And we've seen also several good examples how they strengthen MCS by, for example, they ask their members to implement mandatory VMS or observer programs or electronic reporting and monitoring systems. They have various IUU vessel lists So vessel lists for both for those vessels that are authorized to fish in a certain area, but also those vessels that are not allowed to fish in a certain area. And there's also a recent development is that there's a cross-listing of IUU vessel lists taking place. And in such a way, you could also kind of reinforce or like put a focus on the flag state responsibility, because flag states are in that way put on the spotlight through these RFMOs to really make sure that they strengthen their MCS standards, and that they really control what the vessels that are flagged to these vessels are doing. So I definitely think RFMOs have a very important role to play in strengthening MCS. Of course, the High Seas Treaty is not dealing with fisheries, so that's kind of the difficult issue. What we see for the future also, like how RFMOs will coordinate with in the context of the BBNJ negotiations, because one of the main the key points that underlines the BBNJ negotiations is also that there's not an undermining of existing organizations. But perhaps Sophie can tell us a bit more about the recent developments on this.
Wonderful, thanks Claudia. And it's very smart to pass this very difficult issue about not undermining on to Sophie, who will tell us exactly how this will be solved from the, I'm sure, Absolutely. From the EU perspective. I think if you like, Sophie, I can do the slides.
Yeah, because it's not many many slides, so you can just go to the next. You can already go to the next slide.
Perfect. There we go.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to invite me here. It's very interesting or very good that I can come in after these two very interesting presentations. No police sirens in the background, but possibly children, as we are still sort of in lockdown here in Belgium. But people have become very forgiving for those things in 2020. My presentation will take, I fear, a little bit of a step back from the very practical to the more conceptual. I am, so I'm negotiating on behalf of Belgium, but also on behalf of the EU, specifically for the chapter of area-based management tools and marine protected areas. So that's where my area of expertise, let's say, lies. And what I have to say in general is that how we have been negotiating, it has been much more on a conceptual and sort of less detailed and less practical level than what we've been hearing here. First of all, I'll talk to you about where the negotiations stand at this point. So as Glenn already mentioned, the negotiations of the last IGC, IGC4, the Intergovernmental Conference 4, was supposed to take place at the New York headquarters of the UN in March, April 2020. Of course, this didn't happen, and so we had to postpone the negotiations. For now, we're still looking for another date, but something that would have seemed incredible to us a couple months ago, where we thought that losing half a year, and I'm going to nuance the word losing later on, but losing half a year would be a catastrophe or unthinkable. Now we're looking at more than a year, and we're not sure it would make sense to pick a date which would then be too early either, and which would call for another postponement. So just from a personal perspective, I'm thinking maybe August 2021 is probably the most realistic first slot to organize a big conference where you have mostly delegations which have more than one delegate on them, which requires people to sit entire days and literally put their heads together. So this is it's not I'm an eternal optimist, like Glenn said, but maybe August 2021 is the most realistic optimism that we can have. However, this doesn't mean that we have been sitting still and not moving or not trying to move. We have been, sorry, you can go back to, yeah, sorry. We wanted to keep the momentum. That was at first when we thought it was going to be a couple months delay, we mainly wanted to keep the momentum. And so Belgium, together with Costa Rica and Monaco and a couple of NGO partners, decided to set up some informal intersessional work. And we are far from the only group that has worked on this. There's a huge amount, like, for example, this is one of those contributions to keeping the momentum alive. What we have done was to really reach out to the negotiators, to those people who negotiate the BBNJ, and to get them together and to discuss the different chapters, simply to say, where are we, give some additional feedback on what perhaps we were supposed or we were going to say or going to ask others at IGC4 in March, April 2020, and to be able to do sort of that preparatory work already online. We've held, I think, now 4 sessions already, and they've been quite successful, and I think that they contributed to keeping the momentum alive, and even, and this is me being an optimist again, to gain time for IGC4. We think that now we can say this, that maybe IGC4 in March, April 2020 would have been very optimistic, because there was a lot of ground to cover still. And I'm really hoping that by having this, by using actually the bad thing that is occurring, the pandemic that is occurring, to use it to our advantage, to sort out a couple of issues that otherwise we would have needed to do at the IGC itself. And my hope is that by being able to sort through those issues, or at least be able, when we get to IGC4, to hit the ground running, and to not be with, like, there's been a proposal, we have no idea what you're talking about, explain it, spend nights explaining the proposal, that we would actually be ready to start the negotiations on day one, and not to be in these sort of introductory explanatory modes until perhaps into the second week of the 2-week IGC. So that's my hope. After a couple of months of where we noticed that there wasn't going to be any live sessions anytime soon, the president of the IGC, Ambassador Rina Lee of Singapore, together with the facilitators of the different chapters of the package, have started to do some informal work as well. It is informal, but because it is president and facilitator led, sorry, here's the first interruptions. Oui. Okay, we'll do the rest of this with my daughter. And so we started to see some more so president-led and facilitator-led work, and this is going on through a sort of online forum type setting, where facilitators ask questions, and then the different delegations are able to write their answers. So it's not a discussion, it's not a dialogue, as opposed to what Belgium has been trying to put or to organize, but it's a written discussion. So where you also don't need to take into account the difference, the time difference, etc. So you just log in, you look at what is there, you answer, and this is what's going on right now. And actually, right now we've talked about environmental impact assessments, marine genetic resources, and we're now on to area-based management tools. We have no clear picture on, at this moment, whether there will be an end product of some sort following that intersessional work. But for me, for Belgium, it's in any case important that something comes out of this prolonged intersessional period. And so I'm going to use Christiana Figueres's title of her book or her podcast, which talk about stubborn optimism. I am very optimistic that we need to use this prolonged intersessional period to our advantage and make sure that we actually do deliver when IGC4 will happen. Next slide. So maybe very shortly, I will go through how the EU sees marine protected areas, as this is my area of expertise. Sorry, my daughter keeps interrupting. So we envisage three scenarios. This always happens. They stay quiet when I'm not speaking, and when I am speaking,
this would be the difficulty in having UN meetings with everybody online. It's not always easy.
I'm going to try. If you give me 1 minute, I will go and try to put her in front of a TV screen.
No problem. I wonder, actually, while I'm sharing my screen, I'm not able to see the questions and answers that have been, the questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to pause the screen sharing, and I wonder if, perhaps we can go straight back. It's amazing how calming the TV can be.
Yeah.
Maybe, we'll see.
I don't think she's that calm. She's screaming. But I mean, let me run through this very quickly. So there's three scenarios actually for MPAs that we envisage as an EU, which is the ones that are where there's nothing in place, not even any ABMTs in place. And those would be the from scratch BB&J MPAs. Then there's a complementing scenario where existing ABMTs, for example, from a regional fisheries management organization would be complemented in order to make them not only, for example, focused on one sector, which would then be fisheries, but be larger and be holistic MPAs, as we have tried to call them. And then we look at what to do actually with existing MPAs. For example, within the Regional Seas Convention of OSPAR, there are a number of MPAs already designated, and what to do with those in order to get them universally accepted. Next slide. So what the procedure that we as an EU defend is one that's oriented towards ownership, and I will explain this a little bit further. We're trying to get as many stakeholders involved as soon as possible, and these stakeholders are not only states, all states, but are also organizations, any competent organizations, and they are supposed to be involved starting from the very beginning. Those stakeholders are sort of organizations, the states, but also civil society. And I think that in that sense, in that large inclusive approach, an organization like the Global Fishing Watch would, for example, be very much well placed to be part of this from an early stage. And so the procedure is the criteria for identification, then you have the proposal procedure or step, consultation phase, scientific assessment input, and then actually the decision making. And this decision making is on the designation of the MPA as such, but also on a management plan and then a monitoring and research plan. So their monitoring comes into place. Then we have, of course, implementation, monitoring, and review. You can go to the next slide. Sorry, this is becoming catastrophic in the background. So, I mean, I went through the text, and it's true that monitoring is sort of cross-cutting across the different chapters, but at the same time, there's really not that much concrete there. And so it feels like this is missing, indeed. So in our text, there's really not that much. What we have, and specifically regarding, which Claudia already pointed out, regarding ABMTs, there's an obligation on states parties it's a very good thing that you're saying that we should sort of extend this larger than only on ABMTs. We also have a place where we mentioned that, an article where we mentioned that states should work in competent organization in a manner that delivers. So this includes also any monitoring surveillance aspects that are being dealt with at other existing organizations stage. And then the problem, of course, or the issue, of course, the specificity is that monitoring, surveillance, and control in general, I'm trying to see how we can add that in general to the treaty, because everything is very focused on the different aspects of the package. So, I mean, it would need to be monitoring with respect to existing ABMTs, monitoring with respect to EIAs, monitoring with respect to marine genetic resources. And so I'm trying to see how we can make that more cross-cutting, sort of to also have that in as a general thing.
Sophie, if you want to take a moment to...
yeah, my fear is that I don't know if it's going to be any better, but I'm almost finished here, I think.
Okay.
So I would be happy, I think many delegations would be happy to receive concrete, like I know that Claudia mentioned some aspects, for example, having an article on an obligation being put on states, having that as a more general obligation. That's a very concrete proposal, which we would be open to look at. So I think it would be very useful to receive, not like, I think the problem is it's a little bit like the aspect of financing. It's something we know we have to deal with, but we don't really, we've been to a lot of webinars or actual conferences about how to do that. But at this moment, people are so focused on the text that it's a lot more practical to simply receive, like you can put it here, there, and there. It's sort of like you get tunnel vision when you're negotiating at the UN and you're only looking at the text. So that's something that would be extremely helpful for us. And then something that's interesting to know and that we need to wrap our heads around is that when we say the burden is put on states, I heard Tony say that sometimes it's very difficult to establish which state, and it's often a number of states. And I don't think at this point we don't have the concept of sort of where those different states that are supervising one activity, for example, would be coming together with their monitoring, surveillance, and control. So this is, I think, a gap that we do need to address at this point. Finally, or to end, I would like to say that I think we have two options. Either we try to insert it in the text, or we put hooks in the text and we make sure that somehow the first COPs that will come out of this BBNJ treaty, that they will look at this, that they will get a mandate to work out the details. And it seems to me like probably the hooks in the text with a mandate for the COPs to work on the details is the most realistic option. I think that a COP would be capable of going into the level of detail where we would need to have scientists and people with the technological background to help us negotiators work through those details. So I really apologize for the interruptions. Of course, now I have stopped speaking, so she is calm. But I'm happy to hear questions at this moment. And if I can't answer them, I will say that she cries.
It's always good to have an excuse.
Yeah.
No problem at all. I think yeah, everyone's facing issues with working at home, but still nothing compared to working with UN negotiators, I'm sure. Perhaps while she's quiet, I'll ask you a quick follow-up question, which relates to what you've just said about, you know, it's good to get the hooks in the text and then have, you know, a role for the COP afterwards. I wonder, because the negotiations in some way are now at this late stage, but as you say, are also ongoing and we don't know how long for. Do you see that there will be an opportunity to add new things to the text, or is it now very much focused on what we already have, you know, is there still openness, you think, amongst other states to kind of have new things added at this stage?
Yeah, I do think it's still open. We've seen a number of new proposals already being sent around and discussed bilaterally or in larger settings of things that we hadn't thought about, or simply that are much more, or a proposal which is much more detailed than what is there at this moment. So definitely this window of opportunity has not closed. And I continue to think that we need to look at the bright side of this extended intercessional period and say, well, we hadn't thought of it before, and maybe the treaty in April 2020 would have been closed without this or that particular aspect being dealt with. But now that we have this additional period, let's use it. So definitely still open for any, as long as you don't touch the 4 elements of the package as the basic backbone to this. I think a lot is still possible.
I mean, that's good to know, and certainly it sounds like converting some of this sort of informal discussion into draft text that can really achieve that would be a good idea. Thank you very much for that. It's very helpful to know, you know, from the negotiation perspective where we stand and what can be done. Perhaps I can go to, we have a few questions in the chat box in about 25 minutes. I'll try and distribute them where I see fit, but please do feel free, any of you, to jump in. Perhaps we can come back to you, Tony, bring you back in. We have a question on, like, what are the incentives for flag states to actually agree to measures? And it strikes me that the work that you do already shows what some of the incentives are, you know, what countries can gain by giving their data and working, you know, to improve MCS. So I wonder if you could talk to this question a bit. What incentives can we have for states?
Yeah, it's interesting. The states all seem to have slightly different incentives. And one of the questions that came up in the Q&A was saying that the data sharing comes with a cost. So I don't mean by a dollar cost. It's like, what is the cost of the country for sharing this data? So what we're seeing with most of our partners is they're realizing that the proprietary nature of the data is not as powerful as the public nature of the data. So on the one hand, Indonesia, they shared their information because Ibu Susi, the fisheries minister at the time, wanted to be really clear what was happening in the waters and in Indonesia and surrounding, and was keen, demanding that other countries followed suit, because she wanted to show that she was going to address issues around transparency in Indonesia. So the transparency for her was a very powerful tool to drive forward the policy changes. In South America, we see countries that actually are already pretty transparent. They're leading the way with combating IUU fishing, with ocean conservation. Chile, they had to make a law change in order to share the information, but actually they have a very good MCS system anyway, so they were probably more confident in the need to share this data, but they could see that sharing it had a value in itself in order to encourage a wider use. Panama comes under a lot of criticism for the use of their flag, and the new leadership there are keen to put out in the open exactly what's happening in order that, one, they can address it, and two, they can provide a deterrence to the vessels that now know they're being watched, in the hope that they'll behave better. So they're trying to reduce their problem while showing the world that they want to address the issue. And there are issues to address. It will take them some time. So they all have different incentives as to why that data should be shared. And I think the key one is the point I made right at the beginning, is that there's plenty of examples of countries sitting next to each other, and quite literally there's a line between one country's economic zone and the other, and then onto the high seas. And you'll see that people are fishing that line, and it's very difficult for those countries to deal with that unless they share the information, which goes back to what Claudia said in the sense of Fish Eye Africa. The most cost-effective and easy thing people can do is share that information. in order to break down those barriers.
And actually, Claudia, perhaps you can talk to this a bit as well. We'll have another webinar on Thursday, which looks more at the Southeast Pacific. And, you know, we did a workshop there last year, bringing states together in that region. And it seems that there's some appetite there for cooperation. And I wonder, Claudia, if you can just give us a brief sort of look at what states in that region are thinking in terms of cooperation and what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks. So in general, regarding this question, so what we've seen in our general report, so we've basically published 2 reports now on MCS, one more on MCS in general, which is more like an overview report also of best practices of MCS globally. And then we've written another report on the Southeast Pacific perspective. And in the first report, we've highlighted some best practices of MCS measures. And some of these best practices are international platforms and networks that provide MCS experts with the opportunity to exchange best practices and to also network and to increase trust, if you will, amongst compliance and law enforcement agents. And I think this is a very important element to also encourage flag states and coastal states to cooperate together also at a regional level. Because what we've sometimes noticed with our research in the Southeast Pacific is that there's a lot of MCS technology available. There's a lot of knowledge on MCS tools. There are a lot of good initiatives going on, but there's still very often this distrust amongst countries to share data, which is kind of showing some competitive sides on MCS. Whereas if you think about it, the commons and the high seas, it's something that we all manage together. So there's not really an incentive, or that should be enough of an incentive for states to cooperate together to make sure that any people conducting illegal activities, whether it's fishing, illegal fishing or other illegal activities, that they form a front together and join forces to share their capacity and use joint patrol activities or use platforms like Global Fishing Watch to work together instead of competing with this information. But yeah, we will show some recent good examples and best practices on Thursday in our next webinar.
Thanks, Claudia. There's a question specifically for you, Sophie, on some of more the details of how a treaty will work. And I, for one, found it very interesting, the process you set out wanting to be inclusive, which of course could bring in organizations like Global Fishing Watch and other experts. There's a question specifically on, do we know yet how experts will be identified and what sort of process there'll be for things like impact assessment, follow-up, and is there already a sense of this from the EU perspective of how this might work?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's two different things. So first, we will have a more formal scientific and technical or technological committee. So that is where actually experts in an independent independent experts in their own capacities will function and will do reviews of proposal, for example, for marine protected areas, or will look at environmental impact assessments that have been published by states, etc. So those would be that would be a commission with individuals who would be seating on it. And my thinking is that this would go, this would be organized in a way using the rules of procedures that are used in other organizations of the UN. Like, for example, within CBD, there's a number of scientific committees. With regards to the law of the sea, there are existing scientific committees as well under the UN. So that is one thing. And then the second thing that we have is organizations and stakeholders of all sorts that actively work throughout the process, but as a voice their organization, whatever that organization is. At this moment, we don't have a specific list of organizations, but I could imagine that this would be the same list as the stakeholders that are participating now, which are people that have an ECOSOC standing and which have been, it's not the right term, but which have been accepted as an UN observer. And this can be quite large. I mean, we have, for example, the High Seas Alliance, which is a very active and very constructive observer, and they have a very large amount of member organizations because they're an organization that regroups other organizations. So this allows for some flexibility. And both would not have the same role. The ones that are involved in the scientific and technical and technological committee would not be doing the same things as those who are involved in the procedure itself. But so I'm reading this question, the question also in the chat box, or I was reading it at least. Now it has somehow disappeared. It doesn't matter. But so as an individual expert, I think there's several options, either through an organization within the process. And this includes, for example, for EIAs, the review of the EIAs and the review of the MPAs. And then you have the technical and scientific committee, which has then another role. So there's two possibilities, and we don't have any details written in the treaty, and I don't think we will have any details written in the treaty other than usual UN practice, which leaves room for I mean, it's quite large, so it will leave some room for getting on those.
And presumably, Tony, I mean, organizations like Global Fishing Watch can play a big role here, and perhaps the treaty could give more access or a kind of clearer route to work with groups of states. I'm curious sort of how you could see a treaty sort of helping the more policy directions that Global Fishing Watch is sort of exploring. Do you see, I don't know, more inclusion in these kinds of processes would be helpful?
Yeah, I think the interesting piece about the treaty negotiations is, of course, although everyone has an equal vote at the UN, not all states are equal, really, in the sense of their fleets. So I think there's two ways that systems like Global Fishing Watch and others with this data at hand can help. Is one, to provide quite clear analysis of what is happening. And you've seen that with papers being published, the High Seas Economics paper about slavery and subsidies, but also which states are fishing the high seas most, because they ultimately are what's going to swing any change when it comes to who's most impacted on it from the fishing perspective. But there has to be the science to indicate how the knock-on effects is on those states that are more reliant on the resource themselves, but do not have the capability to go and patrol out at sea, or indeed their own EEZs. So there is a perfectionist view in here in the sense of the openness of data to really change the way the world looks at fisheries, but we expect the change to take years. So most people default to enforcement, and that is needed. There is no doubt about it. And we see some very good examples of huge enforcement actions taking place, whether it be against things like the Thunder and some of the ones that we've seen in the press, like STS-50 and Nika. These are big actions, but it takes a huge amount of resource to chase those singular vessels down for what is a human activity and linked to some beneficial owner down the line. So I think what we've got to try and do is educate the delegations that there's more to technology than purely paying for enforcement. It's about informing the situation and changing the way that we look, in particular at the high seas. From my time in the Navy, we really struggled to work out how to truly patrol on the high seas and deal with piracy, illegal fishing, even illegal radio, all of the things that should not be happening out there. It's quite difficult to do. It's a needle in a haystack. So we've really got to change it around to have people focus on the compliance and reward the compliance. And that way, those people that aren't compliant stand out the second they come to port. And that's the Achilles heel. Every fish has to come to port. So the combination of what's happening out on the high seas or could be happening in a marine protected area or is not compliant behavior should be able to filter out as it arrives in port. And therefore, things like the Port State Measures Agreement and strong port controls are also key to this. So the people in the negotiations in the UN are probably not quite the people that understand exactly how port controls work, or indeed how monitoring, control and surveillance works and those networks. And somehow we have to get those delegations talking to those people who do know it.
Yeah, and I think that's a common thing we see with, you know, these sorts of treaties. They're negotiated by very different people and departments of governments from those that are ultimately responsible for enforcing and making that link is, I mean, challenging at the national level, let alone when you scale up to the UN level and try to get countries to coordinate on this sort of global commons, which I think links nicely to another question I see in the question box here. Because we do already have some organizations, particularly on fisheries, that are groups of states that cooperate on fisheries management. And the question here is, you know, has anyone actually done a deep dive yet on how those organizations fit with the idea of a treaty and what the sort of articulation between those two sort of systems will be? And I wonder, Claudia, if you have any thoughts on what a new agreement might actually sort of bring to RFMOs, or what RFMOs can bring to the agreement, and if this can make that link somehow.
Yes, thanks, Glenn. So this relates to what I said before about the not undermining issue, which is one of the most complicated issues in the BBNJ negotiations, because there's still some not enough clarity amongst negotiators how they see this issue, what the role of existing organizations will be in the context of the current treaty. But so far, it seems that the BBNJ negotiations will provide some complementary role to these RFMOs. And so what RFMOs could do is, for example, to have more inclusive membership, because currently there are only fishing countries taking part in RFMOs. So this still reinforces the sectoral management or the fragmented ocean governance at the moment. So that could be one issue, one way to improve this. But maybe more concretely, what we've also seen or what we've written in our research is that RFMOs could be obliged through the High Seas Treaty to report to the COP on the activities they're doing on MCS. And I think this could be a concrete way to have some more cooperation and coordination, also in the context of area-based management tools or marine protected areas, so that it's clear also to the COP members or the scientific and technical body or whatever institution or body will be created by the BBNJ instruments, what kind of MCS measures are currently already being undertaken by either regional organizations or sectorial organizations. But this is something that has not really been discussed yet in the negotiations. And also just one note to respond to what Sophie has said before. We've recently written a blog with the IDDRI team on this specific issue as well, on some of the issues that are not very much highlighted, that are a bit technical, such as like institutional arrangements and MCS, but which are very strategic and important for the effective implementation of the treaty. So if you're interested in this issue, I would invite you to read that.
Great, thank you, Claudia. We have just one more question that perhaps I could start with you, Tony, about to what extent non-state actors struggle with state sovereignty when working on transparency. So how are these organizations sort of negotiating their relationship to state jurisdiction? And I imagine that this is something that you've had to navigate in your work, working with states, but obviously opening up transparency being potentially threatening to some interests.
Yeah, I was looking at that question and trying to work out exactly what the focus was. But I think all states will maintain their sovereignty, whatever occurs. The question is the state decides on how it would like to act. Now, if you look at organizations like Sea Shepherd, they're increasingly setting up bilateral arrangements with countries in order to provide them with effectively assisted coast guard. You know, the Sea Shepherd vessels are operating with the permission of the coastal state, of the sovereign state. When you saw the Sea Shepherd vessel chase the Thunder from the Southern Ocean all the way up to Sao Tome, the number of jurisdictions that it was potentially passing through was, you know, more than 10, operating 110 days, you know, doing what was often challenged as what maritime forces should be doing themselves, navies and coast guards. But of course, it doesn't work that way, because navies and coast guards patrol the waters that are most pertinent to their own sovereignty. So how do you cross this barrier? So I think what we're seeing is a shift towards what might be called public-private partnerships, that countries realize that they have a national security issue that they have to deal with, and they can deal with it in different ways, the traditional ways of, you know, harder security patrols, more data and held within, or actually they can also start to extend and use the more public platform. So to partner with NGOs like Greenpeace, with Sea Shepherd, with technology platforms like Ocean Mind, Vulcan, Global Fishing Watch. And they're realizing that there's only a limited amount of data that is truly national security level data. The rest of it at some stage becomes more valuable out and shared than it does retained and controlled. So it's different in every state, is going to have a slightly different view of it. And it takes time to change. And of course, you can get very close to one government sharing information, and then they have an election and another government comes in, and immediately the direction changes. So, you know, I'm always wary of talking of countries by name, because really it's administrations and people that provide this leadership. And that's what we need, is individuals, leaders in the different areas to take this on. And even when they're not directly in control, in power, that they should continue to lobby and make it clear that this is an important issue that needs to be dealt with.
And it's an incredibly complex issue, and, you know, administrations change very rapidly, as you say, and then coordinating that then at the sort of international level, it becomes yeah, very challenging. And I guess that having transparency over the long term sort of smooths that out a little bit and makes it a bit easier to have some consistency. We probably have time for just one more question, and I think we've done very well in almost exhausting the chat box, but I actually wanted to take the liberty of asking just a brief personal reflection or concluding thought. I know Sophie is a stubborn optimist, but I wanted to ask what your level of optimism is actually, you know, in the coming 5 to 10 years, when you put together all these technologies, all of this research, increasing cooperation that we see in regions like where we've worked in the Southeast Pacific. You know, how optimistic are you that in 5 to 10 years we will have significantly better transparency on the high seas?
Well, Belgium is a proud supporter of the 30 by 30 initiative. And we always, as a side note, say that it's not just paper parks that we want, it's effective marine protected areas, and 30% is not just supposed to be about the number, but also about the quality. And we feel like with a BB&J agreement, and with that whole process being set up with COPs that will be organized regularly, with responsibilities on states, with scientific and technical and technological committees that are there, and with civil society's eye on us, which I strongly continue to encourage. I think that the 30%, both quality and quantity, should remain a target, and we will be able, with a functioning BB&J agreement, to reach that. But then we need to make we need to adopt it, and we need to make sure that we start implementing it as soon as possible.
Great, thank you. Tony, are you equally stubborn in your optimism?
No, I'm optimistic in total. I think the ocean, the fact that anything beyond the beach, people have struggled to understand. You know, we're not as connected with the ocean directly as we used to be when we were dependent on it for travel around the world. I think what we'll see is as technology becomes cheaper, as access to information becomes more widespread, we'll see it sort of follow what we've seen on land. So those systems where we're crowdsourcing so much data now, whether it be from traffic apps to you know, applications like Facebook, and even, you know, track and trace when it comes down to COVID, some countries are far ahead in the ability to apply that sort of track and trace than other countries, both from their, whether it's a liberal point of view or just a technological ability. So I think we'll see a change where it just becomes more normal that this information is available and shared. The other factor, I think, you know, the strategic shocks of things like COVID are also a big question, because we know how much money has to go into ocean surveillance and enforcement at sea, and we have to look for more cost-effective ways, and you know, the money has to be spread fairly and evenly to deal with these economic stresses. And again, transparency helps with that economic measure, because it is more cost-effective to work with transparent vessels than it is to chase the non-transparent ones.
And we're just at time, so Claudia, I'll have to pressure you to be optimistic in 2 sentences. I'll leave you the final word.
Well, that's a lot of pressure to have the final words in 2 sentences. But yeah, I completely agree with Sophie and Tony that that we can be optimistic for the future, especially if you consider all the technological developments that have taken place in the last 10 years, and that it's much more cost effective to use all kinds of MCS technologies. That Global Fishing Watch, for example, is helping different states to make it MCS more accessible, that there's more realization from the public that MCS is important. So I hope we can use this kind of like green wave or ocean momentum that is going very much to plastic issues to also cover other issues such as MCS, fisheries, and any other human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction.
I see lots of nodding, so I think that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you very much to both Tony and Sophie for joining us. We have another webinar on Tuesday, which will look more specifically on the Southeast Pacific. So Thursday, sorry, we're already in Tuesday. Thursday, same time on Thursday, also translated into Spanish. We'll have a number of speakers from the region talking about the efforts in that region and how they apply to the negotiations as well. So thank you very much again, and we'll hopefully see you in a couple of days' time.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
Sophie, good to see you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Sophie.
Well done to the interpreters, because that was pretty fast at times.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.